Next item.
Item 35 is a resolution to urge amendments to California Senate Bill 827, authored by Senator Scott Wiener, to ensure the value of additional height and density is recaptured, and that San Francisco's existing affordable housing programs and existing neighborhood character is preserved.
Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this resolution, Supervisors Ronan, Yee, Fewer, and Kim, and also note, colleagues, that I have circulated an amendment that largely returns it to the version that was originally contemplated on March the 12th by the Land Use Committee.
I don't have a copy of that amendment, Supervisor Peskin. Thank you.
So this resolution, if we amend it, would urge opposition to California Senate Bill 827. By way of background, when it was considered by the committee, we were awaiting amendments that Senator Wiener indicated would be forthcoming, and we wanted to see those amendments. We have now seen those amendments. It may yet be further amended, but those amendments really do not fundamentally address the issues around tenant protections. Simply stated, while certainly building additional housing in San Francisco is needed, and throughout the region is needed, and throughout the state is needed, I don't think Senate Bill 827, which fundamentally disempowers communities, does not actually lead to density equity in suburban areas, actually concentrates it in some of the densest areas in the state. I think that we should send a signal, as the city of Los Angeles recently did to Sacramento. Obviously, it is not easy to tell a former member of this body that we disagree, but I want to send this as a signal to Senator Wiener, as well as Assembly Member Phil Ting, that those conversations really need to start here with the representatives of the 11 districts and the lawmakers of the city and county of San Francisco. So I think we should send a message of full stop. Let's start this over. Let's enter into real collaborative dialogue to see whether or not there are solutions in Sacramento. There certainly are solutions in Sacramento. Number one is we've got land. We've shown, whether it's in District 3, where we turned former freeway on-ramps and off-ramps into 100% affordable housing projects, whether it was the redevelopment of the shipyard, the rezoning of Market and Octavia in the south of Market. We've got 60,000 units in the pipeline without rezoning any of San Francisco. As Planning Commissioner Dennis Richards stated in committee, we could build an additional 145,000 units, but usurping San Francisco's authority is not the way forward. If the state wants to help, send us some money, address the Costa-Hawkins Act, address the Ellis Act. That, I think, is the right way to go. So, colleagues, I want to thank you for your support, and again, I want to extend a hand to Senator Wiener and Assemblymember Ting to say that we are here and ready to collaborate, but a one-size-fits-all solution that in essence rezones 96% of San Francisco without any community participation, that does not do anything for more affordable housing, that further taxes transit, that does not have any provisions for value recapture, is not the right way to go. And after other individuals speak, I would like to offer the amendment that would oppose Senate Bill 827.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Tang.
Thank you very much. And believe it or not, I do actually agree with the comments that Supervisor Peskin made. I did in committee try to make an amendment about urging amendments versus opposing, because I do think that procedurally it is strange for us to take a position as a board while a bill is still in the process of having amendments being made. So although at this very moment in time, I actually do agree and believe that SB 827 is far too overreaching doing in terms of not allowing local jurisdictions to have say over what kind of development we want and where it would take place and what sort of public value we'd want to recapture out of developments. I am hopeful about amendments and have been speaking with Senator Wiener, who indicated that amendments would be forthcoming next week. So my only comments today are that procedurally, it would be nice for us to, I think, have a resolution adopted after we see the full version of SB 827. But if, again, if there's the desire of this board to weigh in right now, of course, at this very moment, the way that the bill is written, I don't support it as is. Years ago, tried working on legislation citywide around development, and I'm very open-minded about development on the west side of town as long as it's actually on the transit corridors. But even that conversation was very difficult, and it involved a lot of negotiations around what sort of public benefits we would get in exchange for additional density or height. There's none of that in SB 827, and so until I do see those amendments being made, I will at this point oppose it. But just want to note that again, it's representative of this snapshot in time right now as to what SB 827 is at this moment. But if it were to change in any way, shape, or form that actually respects our single-family neighborhoods, I do reserve, I think, that ability to weigh in again at that point. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Yee.
Thank you, President Bree. Well, I'll just state it. I am opposed to SB 827 because it really radically reduces our community's ability to have a say-so in how development occurs in their neighborhoods. And because it creates an expedited pathway for building new housing without mandating any additional infrastructure assistance from the state. Basically, I see, in fact, I believe that SB 827 in its current form will basically expedite gentrification on the west side. I am in favor of building new housing, particularly affordable housing in the west side, but there has to be community input, and we have to be able to ensure that we also meet our city's housing balance goals by creating more affordable units than we are currently generating. This bill would almost certainly spur more luxury housing production and exacerbate the affordability crisis that we find ourselves in while doing nothing to improve our transit and parking problems. Our communities have to play a central role in developing responses that preserve our cultural and economic diversity and the character while striving to accommodate the population growth that we know is happening.
Thank you, Supervisor Yee. Supervisor Cohen.
Good, thank you. I hear the concerns about upzoning in San Francisco through Senate Bill 827 and share the expressed concerns. And I also understand and frankly admire the spirit of the bill. There is a book that's out currently. It's called The Color of Law, and it's written by a gentleman by the name of Richard Rothstein. And in the book, Mr. Rothstein explores the history of residential segregation across America and the role that the federal government played in upholding that segregation. And I see Senate Bill 827 as an effort to explore some of the solutions that are considered in that book to begin to remedy the exclusionary zoning and to ensure that all neighborhoods have a fair share of housing, particularly in a very aggressive market that we have here in San Francisco. Where I am concerned is that the Senate bill falls short in the lack of consideration of affordability. If we really want to help San Francisco's housing crisis, I think we must begin to take local context into consideration before supporting sweeping legislation that might not only change the visual character of many of our neighborhoods, but also, and more importantly, bring limited housing stock to only accessible to the ultra rich. And what is, oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that love. But just a couple questions that come to my mind is what would stop a developer from building an 8-story building with 1-bedroom condos on each floor? Nothing. And this legislation this legislation is currently written doesn't address equity. And I believe that we need to start to move forward with a sense of urgency to be looking at things through an equity lens so that there is an equitable chance that everyone can live and remain in San Francisco. So I wanted just to make sure that we're being thoughtful about the consideration for this vote today. And of course, want to remind former Supervisor Wiener that we are here and we are your partners. And although you're in Sacramento, we still need to be working together and look forward to the continued conversation. I believe this item is going to be heard in committee next week, so it'd be very interesting to see what the folks in Sacramento do with this item. Supervisor Peskin, there's one thing that I do want to point to your legislation. If you look on the first page, page 18, I'm not sure if it's a typo or not, but I'll read the sentence. At the end of 17, it says, in red, underscored, but does not guarantee that tenants will find commensurate temporary housing nor be ultimately displaced. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be nor or if it's supposed to be avoid displacement. It's just a grammatical question that I have, and there might be a way to clarify it, but definitely wanted to get on the record. You look.
I'm just.
Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm just reading the sentence. I think it works.
Okay.
But does not guarantee that tenants will find commensurate temporary housing nor
be ultimately displaced?
Or not, or
not be ultimately displaced?
Nor not be, yes, nor not.
Nor not?
Nor not.
Okay.
Or not. So when I make the, thank you for catching that,
okay,
Supervisor.
No
and when I
problem.
make the motion, I will insert the not.
Supervisor Cohen. Supervisor Sheehy.
Yes. So I do agree with many of my colleagues that, and we certainly heard from plenty of people from the public about concerns with this bill. And I, frankly, was very comfortable with the original resolution that was urging amendments, because I do think the bill is a work in progress and would prefer to have a vote not now, early in the process, but actually a vote on the bill when it's finalized. We do have a housing crisis, and so I absolutely support what the senator is trying to achieve. And, you know, I've got a 13-year-old kid. She's not going to be able to live in San Francisco if we don't build more housing. So, but I think opposing this bill right now is premature.
Thank you, Supervisor Sheehy. Supervisor Ronan.
I agree and disagree with my colleagues. I disagree with Supervisor Sheehy that now is not the right time. I believe that SB 827, even with the current amendments, is fundamentally flawed, and so much so that it's appropriate to go on record right now opposing it. And it would almost need to be a completely different bill for us to reconsider it, in my opinion. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one, I don't subscribe and never have and never will believe that solely increasing supply of luxury housing will somehow eventually trickle down and create the affordable housing that we so desperately need for our teachers, for our nonprofit workers, for our service industry workers, for our working class, for our middle class families. It's never going to happen. We need to recapture value from increased height and density, by the way, which I do not oppose. I in fact, was one of the first supervisors to support a project with increased height and density in my district. I do believe we need to increase height and density where appropriate, but I believe we need to capture that value and make sure that it subsidizes housing for the middle and working class of this city. Second of all, I think the incentives are misplaced in this legislation. Of course, we all support transit-rich, housing development near transit-rich places. But what this piece of legislation does is it almost de-incentivizes areas of California where very purposefully, transit was not built because they wanted to keep people out of those neighborhoods, referring very much to what Supervisor Cohen was talking about. And this does nothing to push those cities that have been exclusive enclaves for mostly white and wealthier communities to produce more housing for all of us. So I see the incentive or the fact that this pushes for more housing to be built in areas that are already producing housing and always have for diverse communities to just eliminate local control or say over how that additional housing should be built. It also sort of completely gets rid of the entire discipline of city planning. We have many city workers who have gone to planning school who specifically design cities so that they are walkable and that they work for people and that there's a substantial infrastructure to support the residents who live in those cities. And it pretty much eliminates in a very radical way that thoughtful development and work that many San Franciscans have engaged in making neighborhood plans and in being involved in the future of what our city looks like. And I thought we had so much debate. I think it drove Supervisor Tang crazy over Home SF, but it was a very worthwhile debate. It went on and on and on, and you very thoughtfully, in my opinion, Supervisor Tang, got us to a place where we all agreed here is a package that allows for additional density and height, especially on the west side of the city where we need more housing to be built, but captures back that value for affordable housing. And this would all but eliminate Home SF and make it a pointless piece of legislation. That doesn't make any sense to me. I could go on and on and on, but I'll spare all of my colleagues. I just want to say that this piece of legislation, however well-intentioned, is so fundamentally flawed that I believe it is absolutely not only correct, but necessary that we go on record as a city opposing it today.
Thank you, Supervisor Stephanie. And can I remind members of the public that no audible expression is allowed per the board chamber rules. You're welcome to use your spirit fingers. Thank you so much all for your cooperation. Supervisor Stephanie.
Thank you. I want to thank my colleagues for their thoughtful remarks on this bill. I too have issues with it. I believe that it is up to our city leaders and communities to engage in local planning determinations and to shape our city's destiny. We as a city have done a great deal to plan for growth. While I acknowledge we haven't built enough housing to keep up with our job growth, I have real concerns about the broad sweeping changes that SB 827 proposes. At this time, I cannot support a bill that goes so far in removing local control. I strongly support addressing our housing needs in transit-oriented development, and I believe that we can do that with input and care from our local communities and neighbors, and I refuse to cut them out of the process. Together, we have worked collaboratively through programs like Home SF that Supervisor Ronan just mentioned, that Supervisor Katie Tang championed, and our inclusionary housing ordinance to address our city's residents' needs. I am certainly also supportive of creating density through special use districts like the development at the old Lucky Penny site. Originally, the site was only zoned for 22 units, and we were able to negotiate with the developers, the neighbors, and labor to get 95 units, which is along a transit corridor. I believe in this type of collaboration, and I believe that it works when we give it a good try. I have heard from numerous residents and community members of District 2, the majority of whom, I would even say two-thirds more than the majority, have expressed grave concerns with SB 827 and its unknown implications. I do believe at this time, I know the bill, everyone's talking about that there will be amendments, but what I have in front of me today is language in SB 827, and I think that it's time to send a strong message to Sacramento that community input is definitely valuable and necessary, and it's why I will be supporting the resolution to oppose the current version of SB 827. As the bill changes in Sacramento, I'd like to receive up-to-date analyses from our planning department. I will be requesting that so that we understand the implications of any amendments, but today, like I said, I cannot support this bill, and I want to say one more thing, because in things like this, you see the division, you see the divisiveness, you see people going at each other, even name calling, which I think is so not appropriate. And I truly think that what unites says on this subject matter is greater than what divides says. And I want to follow up on what Supervisor Peskin said to our to our Senator State Wiener, former Supervisor State Wiener, and Assemblymember Phil Ting, that we are really here to work with you. And housing is an issue that is important to all of us. We may come at it differently, we may think about it differently, but let's get on the same page and let's recognize that what unites says is definitely greater than what divides us. And we want to shape our city's destiny. We don't want Sacramento to do that for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Fewer.
I also wanted to say that I concur with many of the comments of my colleagues, not all, but most. And I just want to say that I am happy to support today the revised version of this that Supervisor Peskin is bringing forward. I think what is evident in this Senate Bill 827 is that, quite frankly, I think Senator Wiener does not understand my neighborhood well at all. So my neighborhood, if people don't know, 65% renters. It is a very moderate neighborhood. Most of my affordable housing is in RH2 and RH1 units that would be decimated with this. Also, 40% of my constituents are of Asian descent, and in Asian families, we live communally. Many of us live in households that are multi-generational, that actually makes it so that seniors and families can actually live in San Francisco, in this increasingly less affordable city. I concur with my colleague, Supervisor Ronan, that I don't believe that building more luxury market rate housing actually has a trickle-down effect for affordable housing and for those who need it the most. I also just want to say I am very concerned about the infrastructure, the lack of infrastructure in promoting something like this, and I mainly say schools. And I have said it many, many times in this forum that we are not planning for schools and for increased residents here in San Francisco. In fact, the San Francisco Unified School District is 5 schools behind the current projected enrollment currently for what's in the pipeline now. And then I also concur with Supervisor Ronan that when you look at the map, you look at that it gives actually San Rafael, it gives San Mateo, it gives Millbrae permission not to build and not to be dense. Quite frankly, I think we're on the right track of what we're doing here in San Francisco. We are building housing, whereas other communities are not. And then I just have to mention that when we talk about transit rich, there are some neighborhoods, quite frankly, that are much more transit rich than others. And my neighborhood happens to be one of those neighborhoods that is not transit rich. We do not have a rail. We do not have an underground. We have been fighting for better service in our neighborhood. And so to say that these transit-rich neighborhoods, I beg to differ that my neighborhood is transit-rich. I think that we are overcapacity in the 38 Gary, $100 million short of the Gary BRT. And so when I see something like this, I just think this is really far-reaching. It is overreaching the authority of the state. And my responsibility to my residents in District 1 is to actually listen to their concerns when development happens. And I really think the work of what Supervisor Katie Kang did around Home SF was very thoughtful. I think it was collaborative. I think after a lot of compromises, and then Supervisor Tang holding strong to making a stronger policy. I think this is how we need to work with our housing policies in San Francisco. And so I just want to say I am happy to support this resolution in opposition of California State Senate Bill 827.
Thank you. Next speaker, Supervisor Kim.
Thank you so much. Want to make a couple of comments about SB 827, although I'm very much on the record on this issue. As someone who has done a tremendous amount of upzoning and density in a district that is a transit-rich corridor, literally, the entire district, the Tenderloin, south of Market, Mission Bay, I just want to say that this is not the right way to build housing. I have negotiated, worked with developers, planners, community, neighborhood leaders for the last 7 years to make sure that we are able to build more housing for San Francisco, but we do it the right way. And that involves a local process. I'm not against upzoning in the West Side. In fact, this board has done upzoning in the West Side. We have done an accessory dwelling unit program, which has doubled the zoning of much of San Francisco. We have supported Home SF, which went through a very long community process led by Supervisor Katie Tang to do both upzoning on transit-rich corridors with an increased obligation on developers for affordable housing. When we confer value to land, which is what this bill does, when you provide more floors, more units, more space for landowners and developers to build housing, you are giving those landowners and developers money. This is a giveaway. This is a giveaway to landlords and developers without asking anything in return for a city and community. When you give any land 10 more units, you're basically giving that owner more money. And every time we have done this in District 6 and certainly throughout San Francisco, in my time on the board, we have given that value by asking that developer to share that value back with San Franciscans by building more affordable housing, by building more middle-income housing, by investing more deeply into transit services, into schools, into childcare, into open space, things that make our neighborhood complete and healthy neighborhoods that we all want to live in. I don't think anyone has done more upzoning than I have. I've also have said that I have built more affordable and middle-income housing than many other city legislators, and I've only done that with upzoning and density. But that is how you build, and this, frankly, this one-size-fits-all build, which doesn't frankly guarantee any new units of housing, is just a bill that that enriches the pockets of landowners and developers here in San Francisco. But I just want to say the other issue with this bill is what Supervisor Ronan has pointed out. It will actually disincentivize public transit investments in our counties and cities that frankly have refused to build housing already. This bill will upzone 96% of all parcels here in San Francisco, but won't upzone Napa, won't upzone Contra Costa, won't upzone Marin. We as a region need to build more housing. And we can't just expect that San Francisco, LA, and San Diego, who frankly are doing their part, are going to be able to build build the state of California out of their housing crisis. But I think that it behooves us not to just talk about what we don't want, but what we want to see instead and how we do build housing. So first I'll mention, I serve on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and we have been trying to link more transit grants to the actual production of housing. The state could do this as well. They want to see other regions build in the state of California, then link more of your state funding to actual production of housing. So if you want a grant to rebuild your highway, you need a grant for a variety of different infrastructure projects. We want to see other cities throughout the state build more housing and to build more affordable and middle-income housing. Second, we want the state to invest more deeply in the actual construction and preservation of affordable and middle-income housing. Government used to be in the business of building housing. We used to build housing. We used to invest public taxpayer dollars into building housing. And in 1980, President Reagan and many other elected officials throughout the country decided that the market should take care of housing, everybody, the poor, the working class, the middle class, and those with income. And we have seen 40 years later where those policy decisions have landed us. We have divested from building affordable working class and middle income housing. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is homelessness as an urban crisis throughout our country has grown. When we stopped building housing for those that couldn't afford it, we started to see homelessness grow as an urban phenomenon throughout the country. We need the state to invest more deeply and more greatly into the production and preservation of affordable and middle income housing. Give us the grant funding. We will build that housing here in San Francisco. Finally, there's several other things that we can do here. San Francisco, by the way, is building. We have entitled close to 30,000 units of housing in our master development area plans. Let's get that housing built, but we can't build it without financing the infrastructure. You can't just build housing. You have to build the sewage system. You have to build sidewalks. You need to build an electricity grid. Maybe the state can help us expedite the funding of that infrastructure so we can build those 30,000 units of housing in shipyards and Park Merced and Treasure Island and Hope SF and Schlage Lock and many others. We also, as I had mentioned earlier, have an accessory dwelling unit program, which has basically doubled
the number of housing that's allowed throughout much of San Francisco and increases value of single-family homes owned by families here in San Francisco. Let's make the ADU process simpler. Let's have a consistent design guideline process with an expedited permit, work with the fire department on egress and ingress, and help our single-family homeowners build rent-controlled units within their home, increase their income, and increase the number of rentable units throughout the city. Finally, I will just say this. As someone who went to battle with our current state senator on the CEQA local process several years ago, I just have to say, I really believe in our local process. There is not a single development, there is not a single area plan that did not get better without the community process that was involved. And in every single development negotiation that I've worked on, and I will often boast about it, I will headline it, in every single negotiation I've gone in on, I've always gone in with our neighborhood leaders and our community leaders, or a member of our labor organizations. There has always been a group of individuals that have been involved in negotiating these high-level affordable housing that we talk about, whether it's 40%, 25%, whatever that percentage is. A local planning process allows for that. A local planning process ensures that developments are being built for the neighborhood and community and not just for the developers and the landowners. And so, you know, for those that get frustrated by this process has actually entitled tens of thousands of units over the last couple of years in San Francisco, and very few of them have gone into litigation. And if we want to build more housing, what we should be instead be focused on is more funding for affordable and middle-income housing, more funding for infrastructure, and working on streamlining the post-entitlement permitting process after the developers have gone through all those hoops. Let's help them through the approvals process after they've been entitled. There's a lot of ways to build housing. SB 827 is absolutely not one of them, and I'm in full support of this resolution that is before us today.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Supervisor Safai.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there's been a lot of really insightful things said this morning. I think that, unfortunately, when we get a snapshot of a piece of legislation, particularly when it's not local, there's a lot of fears and misunderstanding. When I look at the original version of this legislation, my initial reaction was fear about protecting RH1 and RH2. That's pretty much 99% of my district. We don't have anything other than that. But when I read the most updated version of the legislation, I feel a lot easier in terms of understanding the direction it's going. I believe 100%, and I want to say clearly, that local control is something that's extremely important in our planning process. I am a trained planner and have been acting as a planner for the last almost 20 years in San Francisco. I'm very understanding of the planning process and respectful of neighborhood input and all of the different neighborhood organizations and individuals and actors that are represented here today. But when you look at the most updated version of this, I hear it clearly spells out that this bill would require a local government to, if requested, grant a developer or proponent transit-rich housing, which, again, the definition of that is a work in progress, and that also raises a lot of fears. I know Supervisor Peskin, when you came into the Land Use Committee, put up a map, and it showed that almost the entire city of San Francisco could be impacted by that in its initial form. But when we read further, it says that in the bill, that the only bonus would be granted if it meets specific local planning standards, including complying with demolition permit requirements. So again, if you added that and looked at the map again, that would almost take out almost the entire city of San Francisco. So those of you that are concerned about demolitions would not be wholesale based on this. And then also it requires that it meets the local inclusionary housing. So local inclusionary housing, which we spent over a year, myself, Supervisor Peskin, President Breed, Supervisor Kim, Supervisor Tang, all of us that were involved in that, we raised that and amended that for the first time in 15 years. And required the number to go up to 18%. It's 19% now, and in the next few years it'll be 23%. So local inclusionary would also be, then it talks about relocation assistance and locally adopted zoning standards. So I think this is a work in progress. I think if we were to say where it is today and where it was certainly before these amendments, my vote would be no. But based on the fact that this is a work in progress, I think that there's nothing wrong with allowing a process to go forward and a conversation to be had. I think the unfortunate thing about this legislation is that there has been a lot of misinformation and there's been a lot of misunderstanding. And I too was part of that misunderstanding because I did see this as something, as I said again, RH1, RH2 is almost 100% of my district. But when I read it again and I see that it has to comply with local demolition permit requirements, it has to follow local planning standards, it has to meet local inclusionary, then I look at this piece of legislation, I think this is really more about probably empty pieces of land. This is probably more about spaces in the city that are not necessarily currently occupied. So you can hiss and you can put your fingers down all you want, but at the end of the day, this legislation is a snapshot right now. And we will continue to have a conversation about it. It might be the will of this body to send a message to Sacramento today that says, no, we're not going to be for it. And if it were in its current form, I'm certainly prepared to do that because I do believe we have to have something that protects our local controls. But I do see progress within the last month, and I do see an evolution of a piece of legislation that's trying to probably think less about San Francisco and more about other parts of the state of California. And that's often how state legislation is written. So I do see a lot of conflict in this, and I do see a lot of concern, but I do also see a lot of progress in the sense that progress is being made to protect local ideas, ordinances, requirements, and planning standards.
Thank you. President Breed.
Thank you. And thank you, Supervisor Safai, for your comments and clearing up what I believe has been a lot of misinformation on this particular legislation. As I've stated on several occasions, I support the intent of SB 827, and I do support the resolution before the board today without the proposed amendments to oppose this bill unless these particular amendments are adopted. SB 827's goal is to promote more housing near transit. Focusing growth around public transit just makes sense, and I understand that the transit hubs specifically need to be clearly more defined when we talk about transit rich, like I specifically did with my neighborhood commercial transit district legislation, which did not increase height along Fillmore and Divisadero, but it increased density, increasing the number of units that could be built. I've also made it clear that while I support SB 827's direction, I also want to see amendments to ensure we are addressing displacement and other key issues. And I've been working directly with Senator Wiener on a number of these amendments. But what is clear is that we have a deep housing shortage all across the state, and we need to do everything we can to address it. The status quo, which everyone claims that they don't want to see continue, happens time and time again. The average rent we know for a two-bedroom in San Francisco is nearly $5,000 a month. One single-room occupancy hotels are renting for $1,500 a month. We have people living in their cars because they can't afford to rent a unit, and everyone is talking about displacement and housing and affordability and all of those things, and we're not doing enough to make sure that we build more housing and we build more housing faster. I grew up in the Western Addition, and people who I grew up with can no longer afford to live here. When I think about folks who are growing up now in San Francisco, where are they going to live? Where are the next generation of San Franciscans going to live? Not in San Francisco, clearly. We're continuing down that same pattern. This bill in its current form does not change our ability to deal with local controls, as was stated, including permits, including requiring discretionary review, CEQA, or other conditional use approvals. It doesn't take away those local controls. It also allows us, as Supervisor Safai has stated, to apply our local inclusionary requirements and set our own demolition restrictions and design standards. Senator Weiner has already inserted language into the bill providing tenant protections, including requirements that if a tenant is displaced, the developer must house that tenant at no increase of a rent for up to 42 months and then offer them a comparable unit in the new development at the same rent that they were paying before. This is exactly what we did with Trinity Plaza and for the project we just approved for the Conservatory of Music student housing that just was voted on by this board today. What I have made crystal clear directly to the senator is that we can grow without displacement. We know all too well the history of this city and what has happened in the Western Addition under the redevelopment agency. We don't want redevelopment 2.0. We can't repeat the same mistakes of the past. I have asked Senator Weiner to amend his bill to focus on incentives of empty lots, parking lots, underutilized strip malls. This is exactly what we did, or what we're going to do, with the purchase of the McDonald's site on Haight and Stanton. We are not displacing anyone, and we're going to be able to build 100% affordable housing on this completely underutilized lot. And to also make it clear to exclude parcels with housing currently on them. The author of this resolution is now proposing that we oppose SB 827, despite the fact that Senator Weiner has informed us that the bill will be significantly amended in just 1 week. Why won't we at least wait a few weeks to see exactly what the bill looks like? The board knows the bill is going to be revised very shortly, yet we won't even wait for that to occur. Knee-jerk opposition to SB 827, as opposed to expressing concern and committing to working with Senator Weiner and our state delegation on amendments, sends a loud and clear message that San Francisco's Board of Supervisors isn't serious about addressing this deep, affordable housing crisis. Let's acknowledge that the bill needs work, that it's getting that work, and that we should work with Senator Weiner and not just respond with opposition. And so, as I said, based on the amendment to specifically oppose this bill, I am happy to support the requested suggestions on amendments, but I will not be outright opposing this bill. I think it sends the wrong message. We can do better than that.
President Breed, are you making a motion for amendments?
No.
Okay. Supervisor Ronan?
Yeah, I don't know if the city attorney could answer a question for me on SB 827. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's my understanding. Can I ask the city attorney if you're able to answer questions on SB 827?
Deputy City Attorney Andrew Shen, through the President to Supervisor Ronan, no, unfortunately, we won't be able to provide advice today on the proposed legislation. Okay, well, but we can certainly follow up with your office after this meeting.
Okay, that sounds good. So it's my understanding from reading the recent amendments that Senator Weiner made to the legislation that it actually took away, in my opinion, made the legislation worse, not better. And it did that by automatically qualifying projects for SB 35 streamlining process, including no secret review, if, even for those projects where we are meeting our RENA category, we have met or exceeded the goal. So in other words, with the Housing Accountability Act, SB 35 takes away any sort of checks and balances at the local level, including CEQA, for any RENA category that we've met where we haven't met our goals. So currently, San Francisco, and for decades past, we have never met our affordable housing goals under RENA, but we have met our market rate housing goals. And what this legislation would do is it would allow, even for market rate housing, which many of these projects will do, take advantage of SB 35 streamlining process, meaning these projects would not get CEQA review. So if you can imagine, you might have, like, for example, a street where there's single-family homes, and in the middle of that street, they take advantage of SB 827 and build a 5 to 8 story condominium, depending on how the width of the sidewalks and the streets. And let's say that and then let's say the developer takes advantage of state density bonus. Maybe it's a couple of stories even higher than that. And then let's say it's near a school and casts a shadow on that school playground where our kids get their only exercise for the day. No CEQA review. No CEQA review of that project. That's insanity to me. And so I think it is absolutely imperative that we go on record today opposing SB 827, because so far some of the amendments that Senator Wiener has made have made it better, in my opinion, but some have made it worse and as a matter of fact, expanded the reach of SB 35, taking away local control and input into the process.
Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I just want to be clear about, because there was reference to the bad old days of redevelopment, and I'm just reading from the digest of the bill. The bill would require an eligible applicant who receives a transit-rich housing bonus to provide benefits to eligible displaced persons who are displaced by the development, including requiring the applicant to offer a right to remain guaranteed to those tenants and to make payments to eligible displaced persons for moving and related expenses, as well as for relocation benefits. The bill would also require an eligible applicant to submit a relocation benefit and assistance plan for approval to the applicable local government. The reason I want to bring this up is because the fundamental premise of this legislation is displacement. So I think that there are two issues. One issue is the issue over local control and what is properly the jurisdiction of this elected body as lawmakers. And I say that as a lawmaker who has built affordable housing in the district that I represent, who has voted for rezoning large swaths of the city, who has worked with other supervisors on, you name it, accessory dwellings, home SF, inclusionary housing, the list goes on, but this has always been the jurisdiction of local government. So that's the first issue. The second issue, as I previously referenced, is the issue with regard to displacement. And when we think about the lessons that we all learned, that we do not want to repeat, that we continue to try to solve for relative to what happened in the Western Addition and the Fillmore, where we still issue certificates of preference, and I've been happy and honored to support that legislation. Once people are displaced, great, you got a relocation plan. Their lives move on. They don't come back. They're displaced. And the fact that there are pages here about relocation plans and displaced person, benefits and what have you, fundamentally means that this is going to rip people's lives asunder. And that's just not right. As Commissioner Richards said, without rezoning any of San Francisco, we could build 145,000 units of housing. But we are rezoning. Matter of fact, we just all voted for the fiscal feasibility pursuant to Chapter 29 for 1,100 units of housing at Balboa Reservoir. And there's 60,000 units in the pipeline. I've lived here now for almost 30 years. This city has changed in front of our eyes. You might not like it, but yes, I voted for the Rincon Hill plan, for Market Octavia, for we're about to do Central Soma, albeit I've said in committee repeatedly that I think it needs to have more housing than it currently has. But that is the purview of what we do here, what our planning commission does, what our planning department does. And this is also about conferring huge amounts of value and running up the cost of land and housing without any value recapture. So when you're talking about a McDonald's site, I say respectfully through the chair to Supervisor Breed, that site would have cost a lot more than $15 million if this transit-rich bonus had been given. It's going to just run up land costs through the roof. It's going to make stuff less affordable in San Francisco. And so, anyway, we obviously have as I said before, I think we should send a message to Sacramento that this dog does not hunt, and let's start over again. And if Sacramento wants to be helpful, help us address the Ellis Act, help us address Costa-Hawkins, and send us a bunch of money so we can build more affordable housing.
Thank you.
Next speaker, President Breed.
Thank you. Through the chair, Supervisor Peskin, to be clear, my comments regarding the displacement was to focus on clarifying what was specifically in the legislation, but I have made it clear to Senator Wiener that my recommendation of amendments would be to make sure that no housing where people live are included in this legislation, and he has been open to making sure that that occurs. So I want to be clear that there are two different things. Currently in the legislation, there's information around displacement. I have made it clear that we don't want to look at parcels with housing currently on them and focus instead on empty lots in places where there are underutilized properties and underutilized strip malls and parking lots and things of that nature. So two different things. I want to be clear about that. And thank you for your comments. I mean, part of the reason why I think it's important to make the recommendation around the proposed amendments is to send a message, but to just outright propose a opposed position rather than try and work with Senator Wiener on this bill, I just think is not the right approach, because clearly, based on our read of the legislation and some of the comments here, not everyone is completely clear on what is actually in the bill. And I think that what's important for us to do today is to send a message with recommendations of amendments. But again, I'm happy to support your amendments. I'm not supportive of an opposed position and would be open to dividing the file and voting on the other parts of the amendments as proposed other than that.
Madam President, if I could I just want to
Supervisor Peskin.
Speak to one issue of fact, and this is really more to, through the President, to Supervisor Safai about, because I keep hearing that this is only going to affect vacant lots and underdeveloped lots.
I didn't say that. I'm saying I'm making the recommendation, not that this is only going to.
No, I understand.
Okay.
It was more to Supervisor Safai. So I just want to quote from the February 5th memorandum by our planning department, which says Senate Bill 827 would affect most of San Francisco and would significantly upzone most of the city. As shown in the attached map, almost 96% of the city's parcels are within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop or 1/4 mile of a transit corridor, meeting the definition in Senate Bill 827. So I just want to be clear that it does affect 96% of San Francisco as currently written, and that was really more to Supervisor Safai. I just wanted to get that point on the record.
Thank you for getting on the record. Supervisor Safai.
Thank you. So you read from a February 5th memo, Supervisor Peskin. This amended version is March 1, 2018. So the March 1 version 2018 has the language in there specifically, then that's what I was reading before, that says that it has to, including complying with demolition permit requirements of the local entity and the local planning standards. So that memo doesn't necessarily apply to the most, it does not apply to the most updated version. And that's the point that I was trying to make. You're absolutely right. When we met in land use and the map that you showed that was based on the planning department's memo, that would be 96% of San Francisco. But I would be interested in seeing them produce a new map based on the amended version, because our demolition requirements in San Francisco are probably the strongest in the state of California. They're almost at, well, you all can laugh, but we don't live in Merced. They have no demolition controls. We don't live in Antioch. We live in San Francisco. And in San Francisco, our demolition controls, whether you like them or not, are probably the strongest in the state of California. And so my point is, if you were to produce that memo again today based on the amended version, what I'm saying is, based on our local planning standards, our demolition controls, and the other planning requirements that we have, we would probably be reduced to empty lots as the applicability of this legislation. And I think what President Breed is saying is, and what I heard her say, is the urging of the senator to amend his legislation to clearly spell that out, to reduce it even further, to say, we're not even really thinking about, like, as to Senator Ronan's point, removing the language, and to your point, Supervisor Peskin.
Supervisor Ronan, not Senator Ronan.
Senator Ronan. Supervisor Ronan. We're all still on vacation a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. Supervisor Ronan, to your point about the amendments and the clarification and how it might have even, my understanding is that this was intended to respond to some of the concerns in other parts of the state of California as well as San Francisco about demolition in general, but using our own local demolition controls and the displacement controls, I would say that it going even further would be to say that to narrow this legislation as President Breed has proposed, to clearly spelling out that this would affect vacant lots in general. And then to former President, Supervisor Peskin.
Everybody's getting a promotion.
Sorry. Supervisor Peskin's point of spelling out and identifying the definition of what transit-oriented development would be. I know in its current form it would have a much longer and stronger impact in San Francisco.
All right, thank you. At this point, I just want to remind the chamber that we have these board rules that prohibit people from verbally expressing how they feel. And so at this point, just want to remind you to use your spirit fingers. If you like what you hear, go like this. And if you don't like what you hear, just do a thumbs down. It's visually just as impactful as hearing your voice. Supervisor Kim.
I just have to reiterate this point, and I only go back to the Giants because we just voted on that deal a few weeks ago. The mandatory inclusionary rate at that year was 12% on site. We could have simply upzoned Seawall Lot 337 and said, instead of building 800 units, you now get to build 1,600 units. And said we built more affordable housing because 12% of 1,600 units is more than 12% of 800 units. But the math just doesn't work out that way. When you significantly upzone land, you enrich the pockets again of landowners and developers. So you have to have them do more than 12%. And in this case, they did 40% on-site affordable and middle-income housing. That is how much we are leaving at the table when we simply increase height and density without asking the developer to share that value back that we gave, that we, the government and the people gave to developers in exchange for them building more housing. Every single unit that they get to build is more money lining the pockets of developers and landowners. How we confer value is we ask them to share that value back. Sometimes it's in the form of building more affordable and middle-income housing. Sometimes it's in the form of increased investments to transit infrastructure, sidewalks, pedestrian safety, schools, child care centers. We are leaving money at the table if we simply say that SB 827 should just apply to vacant parcels in San Francisco. That is absolutely the wrong way to build here in San Francisco. We do not let developers get away with that type of wealth without giving back to San Francisco. So I just think that amendment alone is a humongous giveaway, and that should not be the reason why we stand on not opposing SB 827 today. And if the state wants us to build more housing, give us the funds to build more affordable and middle-income housing. We want to make San Francisco more affordable. We have to build more affordable and middle-income housing to do that. Building as much luxury and market-rate housing as possible is not going to make San Francisco more affordable. It has not made San Francisco more affordable today. We simply need to subsidize more affordable and middle-income housing, and that is something the state can do. And I look forward to the day when Senator Wiener introduces that measure.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Seeing no names on the roster, Supervisor Peskin, you'd like to propose your amendments?
Thank you, Madam President. So I would like to propose the amendments that are before all of you, which I previously described, and thank you to Supervisor Cohen. What I would suggest on page 1 at line 18 is to say, nor be ultimately protected from displacement.
Okay, and just for clarity, Supervisor Peskin, you have a number of amendments here. Some I support and some I don't. So unless you're prepared to introduce them separately, I will be opposing them all.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. All right, so
So that's the
Supervisor
motion.
Peskin has made a motion to amend. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Ronan. Madam Clerk, please call the roll on Supervisor Cohen.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Supervisor Peskin one question. Would you be willing to include a clause that would urge Senator Wiener to consider additional amendments that might support local control?
Supervisor Peskin?
Thank you, Madam President. Through the President to Supervisor Cohen, I mean, I think that is the fundamental underpinning of this legislation, which is it takes away local control. That's exactly why the City Council of Los Angeles voted to oppose it. I think it's fundamentally flawed. I mean, I would like to have a
Sounds like the answer is no.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, Madam Clerk, on the amendment, please call the roll.
Supervisor Breed?
No.
Breed, no. Supervisor Cohen?
Yes.
Cohen, aye. Supervisor Fewer?
Aye.
Fewer, aye. Supervisor Kim? Kim, aye. Supervisor Peskin?
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Ronan? Ronan, aye. Supervisor Safai?
No.
Safai, no. Supervisor Sheehy?
No.
Sheehy, no. Supervisor Stephanie? Stephanie, aye. Supervisor Tang?
No.
Tang, no. Supervisor Yee?
Aye.
Yee, aye. There are 7 ayes and 4 noes, with Supervisors Breed, Safai, Sheehy, and Tang in the dissent.
The amendments pass. And Madam Clerk, I'd like to divide the file without the amendments and take the file previous to the amendments, and please call the roll on that without objection.
So as a point of clarification.
Supervisor Peskin?
So in other words, you would like to, so we would have, the first vote would be on urging amendments and the second vote would be on opposing Senate Bill 827?
Yes. Wait, I'm sorry, no.
It
would just be everything that was previously in here that was urging amendments, and then your specific amendments that are opposing. Yeah, exactly what you just said. Supervisor Kim.
I just have, maybe this is a procedural question, but how do you divide a resolution when that language is no longer in the resolution? So you can divide the question and split portions of the resolution and say, I'm going to vote yes on this and no on that. But the language that you want to vote for, President Breed, is no longer in the resolution, so there's nothing to divide. They have been stricken. So I just don't know how you vote for language that's been stricken. I think you have to vote no on this item.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim.
You could also just divide the portion that remains that you like. But again, you can't vote on something that is no longer there.
Thanks. And I apologize, I didn't see this other page with the language stricken from the resolution. And so, okay. So, Madam Clerk, I'd like to divide the file to pull out the portion that specifically opposes the SB 827 and vote on the remainder of the resolution.
So, Madam President, this item, item 35, has been amended.
Yes.
And you would like to duplicate the file, and you're using the word divide. When you are dividing a file, each of the divided questions have to be able to stand on their own. So specifically, you're interested in pulling out which line items.
So I apologize, but I just got the amendment and just saw page 3 of the amendment, which has those lines stricken from that. So I don't see specifically where that location is.
So, Madam President, may I just recommend that you pass over this item, and we can have a conversation about the specific pages and line items you would like to divide.
Okay.
And we can move forward with the rest of our agenda.
Just as a point of information,
Supervisor Peskin?
I know you can divide ordinances. Can you divide out resolutions? I don't recall, I mean, I don't have the yellow book in front of me, but I don't think you can divide resolutions. I think you can divide ordinances.
Through the President to Supervisor Peskin, I believe that if we are dividing the question, you could divide the question if each of the questions are able to stand on their own, whether it's an ordinance or a resolution. The question is, can they stand alone?
Okay, so without a Supervisor Kim?
I was just going to point out that the title of the resolution is now Opposing State Senate Bill 827. And so just logistically, I don't see a way to divide the question because it's pretty unilateral in its position. What I would recommend, if you'd like to take a vote on this, although we technically just took that vote, is to duplicate the file, put in your amendments, have that go for a vote, although that's exactly identical to what we just did in reverse.
Okay, so what we're going to do is come back to this item in just a moment so that we can get clarity.